If you want to understand our current moment and our future, you have to look to the past and the particular period that tells us almost everything we need to know about our own times might not be obvious to you. It's not the 60s, and it's not even World War II, although they are important. It's the last quarter of the 19th century. This is the period when the current Pluto-Neptune cycle, the slowest and most powerful cycle in mundane astrology, began. It was the era when the technologies that define our modern world of instant global connectivity have their origins. And it was also a time of profound spiritual ferment, when hugely influential occult movements emerged, whose ideas inform spiritual thinking to this day. Friedrich Nietzsche's interpretation of the moment has been immortalized in his famous declaration of 1882, "God is dead, and we have killed him." In this series of videos, we'll be diving deep into the themes of this period, and we'll be using our understanding of the cycle that began at that time to understand where our world is heading in the coming years. In the first episode of this series, we saw how, at the very end of the 14th century, conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune moved, for the first time in tens of thousands of years, into Gemini, the mercurial sign of the twins. But that was half a millennium before the late 19th century, when the current cycle began. So what I'm going to show in this episode is how the events around the time of the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1398 and 1399 predicted the great trends that would unfold over the next half a millennium. In other words, I'm going to prove to you that we can use these Pluto-Neptune conjunctions as predictive devices, and that will show you why understanding the themes of the late 19th century is so important to understanding our world today. So if that sounds good to you, then pack your sandwiches and let's go on another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. In 1398 and 1399, we saw 3 Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in early Gemini. This ended the age of Taurus and initiated the age of Gemini, the sign of the twins. Gemini is an air sign, which links it with thinking and the life of the mind. Gemini's clever and boundlessly curious. Its fundamental urge is to learn about the world and communicate what it's seen. A good Gemini wants to live 100 lives. The American poet Walt Whitman had a Gemini son, and he wrote the famous lines, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And interestingly enough, Bob Dylan, who had a son, Venus and Mercury in Gemini, appropriated Whitman's line in his own song, "I contain multitudes." And so Gemini is the sign of duality and by extension of multiplicity, because 2 becomes 4, which becomes 8, which you get the picture. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, the messenger of the gods, the trickster, the trader, the interpreter, the psychopomp who moves between worlds. So in 1398, it became the turn of Mercury to take the reins from Venus as the planet shaping the evolving collective consciousness of mankind. And as we've already seen, when all 3 of the outer planets form close configurations, we see especially transformative moments in time. And the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1398 and 1399 were opposed by Uranus in Sagittarius, another sign associated with dynamism and knowledge. Now, I'm going to beg your forgiveness right now, because in what follows, I'm going to focus on events that happened in Europe. This is because my primary goal here is simply showing that we can use these conjunctions to predict future developments. And also, it's because, for good or ill, what happened in Europe around that time ended up having huge ramifications for the rest of the world. But I want to make it clear that the work of seeing how these cycles played out in different parts of the world is something that desperately needs to be done. Maybe you're going to do it. With that said, what's pretty much beyond doubt is that the dawn of the 15th century is an apt moment to draw a line in European history, because it's around this time that scholars generally agree that, as far as Europe is concerned, the medieval period ended and the modern era began. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death had killed hundreds of millions of people and forced a great reset on medieval feudal society. And by the time of these conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune in 1398 and 1399, the great cultural flourishing of the Renaissance was getting into gear. The Renaissance saw scholars and artists re-examining and becoming inspired by the art and literature of ancient Rome and Greece. But it also marked the emergence of a new subjectivity and concern with the interior stirrings of the soul. It was the time of Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. But there were some particularly telling events that happened around the time of the conjunctions that we'll be focusing on, because they essentially predicted the coming 500 years of history. Now, if you're enjoying this video, please do me a little favor and click the like button to let YouTube know that you appreciate this content, and do subscribe to the channel to make sure you catch the rest of this series. As I've said many times before on this channel, conjunctions are incredibly powerful predictive devices. A conjunction is a seed moment, a microcosm, and just as a seed contains within it the instructions needed to grow a tree, a conjunction reveals the plan for the cycle it initiates. If we want to understand what any given planetary cycle promises, we look to the events that happened at the time of the conjunction. Now, as you'll probably know, medieval society in Europe had been characterized by feudal, hierarchical organization, as well as the incredible power of the Roman Catholic Church. But between the years of 1378 and 1417, something happened that hugely disrupted the spiritual order. Bishops in both Rome and the French city of Avignon claimed to be pope. The details of how this happened aren't too important for our purposes, but the point to understand is that for almost 40 years, there were two papacies, and different kingdoms in Europe supported one or the other. This is what's known as the Western or Papal Schism. In other words, at this conjunction in Gemini, sign of the twins, the Catholic Church was split in two. Astrology, eh? But that wasn't the only disruption to Europe's spiritual order that happened at that time. The same period also saw the emergence of church reformers who began to challenge the legitimacy and authority of the all-powerful church. Men like Jan Hus in Czechia and John Wycliffe in England argued that the church had become corrupt, and they criticized the luxury that the clergy enjoyed in contrast to the poverty of the average member of the flock. Perhaps we may have seen an element of the shadow side of Taurus and its ruler Venus in the corrupt opulence of the late medieval church. But one of Mercury's primary functions is to critique and destabilize. And so once our Pluto-Neptune conjunctions shifted to Mercury's sign of Gemini, we saw critique of that opulence. Each of the signs of the zodiac acts as a corrective to the previous one. And Jan Hus and John Wycliffe also had another important critique of the church. At this time, most ordinary Christians couldn't read the Bible themselves because it was written in Latin. So they had to rely on the church and its priests to interpret the word of God for them. Remember, as we saw earlier, Venus is the planet of priesthood. But around the time of these first conjunctions in Gemini, John Wycliffe had the Bible translated into English so that ordinary people could read it. And Jan Hus, who ended up being burned at the stake as a heretic for his beliefs, had the Bible translated into Czech for the same reason. So to summarize, these conjunctions seem to signal a split in the church and a rise in opposition against it. And I think you know what happened next. But before we look at what ended up happening in the cycle, there's one more extremely important development that happened around the time of those Pluto-Neptune conjunctions, and it's this. In 1394, a nobleman named Dom Henrique of Portugal, who's commonly known these days as Henry the Navigator in English, was born. And in 1415, with the Pluto-Neptune conjunction still just about in orb, Henry and his father conquered the Muslim port of Ceuta on the North African coast. In other words, this period also saw the first stirrings of European naval exploration of the globe and the first European colony in Africa. And I think you'll already have figured out what I'm getting at, because we can see in the events I've described the beginnings of the transformative trends of the next 500 years of world history. In the middle of the 15th century, Pluto and Neptune began to form a sextile aspect, the first major aspect of the cycle that had begun with the conjunctions in Gemini in 1398 and 1399. And it was at this time that a man named Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, in today's Germany, was perfecting a new invention, a printing press using movable type. And it goes without saying that this invention caused a seismic revolution in history. We could argue that this was the beginning of the information age that we all, for our sins, are living through now. And to give you a little hint of where we'll be going later in this series, we'll note for now that just as the sextile of the first Pluto-Neptune cycle of the Age of Gemini gave us the printing press, the first sextile of the second Pluto-Neptune cycle of the Age of Gemini gave us this thing in the fateful year of 1947. This is the transistor. And just like the Gutenberg Press, it's caused more than a little bit of disruption. But that's for another episode. Another layer to this is that in the 15th century, conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn were taking place in water signs, so this was an age of water. Remember how I said in the first episode that cycles are all sandwiched on top of each other? Well, this is an example of that, and it provides us with another layer of meaning that we can factor into this story, because one of the themes that tends to leap out during ages of water is the emergence of new faiths and ways to connect with Source. Remember, Jupiter is the planet of faith, and it's very strong in the water signs. It rules Pisces and it's exalted in Cancer. So this is an important piece because it speaks to what the Gutenberg Press was initially and primarily used for. It was used to print the Bible. And ultimately the consequences of this were that Bibles went from being something only the church and very wealthy people could possess to something much more accessible and affordable. In other words, the press enabled the visions of Jan Hus and John Wycliffe to become a reality, and it was the beginnings of a huge boom in literacy that eventually implicated the entire planet. But there's more, because in the early 16th century we saw a configuration of planets in the sky that's very similar to what we're seeing in our skies right now. We've already seen how the most truly consequential moments in history tend to come when all three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are closely interacting with each other. The axial age was the prime example of this. Well, by the early 16th century, the 1500s, the 1510s, Neptune in Aquarius was still in range of a sextile with Pluto in Sagittarius, but Uranus had also raced ahead into Aries and formed a trine with Pluto and a sextile with Neptune. This is what we call a minor grand trine. And the name of that configuration should ring a bell because, as we saw in the first episode of this series, that's exactly the configuration we're seeing right now, which will only become more perfect in the next few years. And this period of the minor grand trine in the 16th century was rather important. In 1492, with Pluto and Neptune within 6 degrees of a sextile, Columbus had quote-unquote discovered America. And in 1519, Hernan Cortés landed in Mexico. In 1526, Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru. In other words, we saw major developments in the history of European empire and colonialism here, and they've been foretold by the explorations of the Portuguese and Henry the Navigator during the conjunctional period of this Pluto-Neptune cycle. Predicting the future's pretty easy, actually. But that wasn't the only epochal development of this period. Around the very same time, a German theologian named Martin Luther appeared on the scene, making very similar arguments to those of Jan Hus and John Wycliffe. In 1517, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses, or Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg. And in that document, he argued that the church had become corrupt. And later, wouldn't you know it, he was also responsible for the translation of the Bible into a vernacular language, in this case, German. Luther's protest was the launch of the Reformation, and it led to the emergence of Protestantism, a new Christian religion that denied the authority of the Pope and preached that every Christian could and should read the Word of God themselves, hello Mercury, and have a personal relationship with divinity. All this was predicted by the conjunctional period of the late 14th and early 15th century, when Wycliffe and Hus made pretty much the same arguments. Now, all these things alone would be enough to cement this period of the minor grand trine as one of incredible historical importance. But there's one other thing that happened at this time that was arguably just as significant, and it had to do with this man. This is the Polish Polymath, Nicolaus Copernicus. And around 1514, or perhaps a little earlier, With this minor grand trine in effect, Copernicus formulated his theory that the Earth was not, as had been thought by the Europeans of the age, at the center of the cosmos. The Earth, he realized, in fact revolved around the Sun. Now, he wasn't the first thinker in history to arrive at this conclusion, but nevertheless, the heliocentric theory meant that human beings were no longer at the center of the universe. And if that basic assumption could be challenged, what else was up for debate? What followed from that time was the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. And since then, we've ended up questioning every basic assumption we've ever held about the nature of reality. Mercury is the planet of the rational mind, of skepticism and analysis. And this 500-year period also saw the development of the modern scientific method and ultimately the emergence of an extreme skepticism around matters of spirit, particularly in the West, hence Nietzsche's dramatic statement. Skepticism and deconstruction are mercurial specialities, and don't they go to the heart of the nature of our modern times? At the same time, Mercury is also the planet of trade and business. And as many thinkers have noted, the emergence of Protestantism helped to create the modern capitalist world. Certain Protestant faiths, particularly Calvinism, actively encourage their flocks to do business and go forth and thrive in the secular world. And as the sociologist Max Weber argued, the Protestant work ethic drove capitalism from its own emergence in the early 16th century, and that was, of course, one of the major drivers in the formation of the globalized world that had emerged by the end of the 19th century. Simple, but now we're going to tie all of this together by returning to the present. Here are the current positions of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You'll see that they're already in a minor grand trine. And as we've seen in 2026, this configuration will become almost exact, with the planets all at 4 degrees of their respective signs. But the configuration never became close to this perfect in the early 16th century. And bear in mind that the closer aspects become, the more powerful they are. This is why astrologers are so excited about the astrology of 2026. And honestly, this is why I suspect that very few of us are ready for the magnitude of the changes that are coming to the world in the next few years. And so you're no doubt asking, what are these changes going to be? Well, there are clues all over the news and all over our history, if you know where to look. Now, if you made it this far, thank you so much. I'd just like to take the opportunity to let you know that I am still available for private natal consultations where I'm focused on helping people to situate themselves in time, find purpose and calling in the world, and navigate these very strange times. And I'm also available for electional consultations where I will find you the best possible moment in time to initiate that important project that means everything to you, whatever it may be, so long as it's not evil. Find the details in the description below. Now, in the next episodes of this series, we're going to be trying to understand what's coming in the future by harnessing the predictive power of conjunctions. And a little warning, things are going to get a hell of a lot weirder and wilder from here. That's it for this episode. See you next time.